Good evening. My name is Nishita Biswas and I'm an undergraduate student currently pursuing English honors in Ranibela Girls College, Kolkata. I welcome you to the stories of tribal identity and culture that will explore the role of cross culturalization of tribal communities in shaping cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS Review December 2024 in collaboration with the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, University of Victoria. We are also calling for submission of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself extremely privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelist, Dr. Devnath Pathak, who will be joining us shortly. Professor Manisha Sharma, and Dr. Nihar Ranjan Mishra, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic for today's discussion is role of literary and artistic translation in cross-culturalization. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Manisha Sharma. Manisha Sharma, PhD, is an artist, educator, and scholar, and currently a professor and department chair in art education at the University of North Texas, Denton, USA. Her work examines how perceptions of culture and community are formed, internalized, and acted out through the production and consumption of art and visual culture artifacts. She focuses on studying and teaching how different communities create, interpret, and express culture through art in order to navigate social and cultural differences and offer guidance on designing and conducting art workshops and training sessions and discuss topics like visual literacy's significance in society and education. Additionally, Professor Sharma explores creative thinking across different aspects of life and profession, study international models of arts and education, create art-based programs and curricula for various educational settings, and lead community-oriented art initiatives and research. She has published in several books, journals, and editorial roles, including journals and two co-edited books. It's a pleasure to have you with us this evening, Professor Sharma. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Nishita. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are, everybody. I want to thank you for inviting me to be a part of this very illustrious panel. I just want to confirm that you can hear my voice clearly.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes.
So,
Our next speaker, I'm
sorry.
so sorry, ma'am.
No, go ahead.
Our next speaker for the session is Dr. Nihar Ranjan Mishra. Dr. Nihar Ranjan Mishra is currently working as a freelancer. He has around 16 years of postgraduate teaching and research experience. He served as Associate Professor and Department of Humanities and Social Sciences and also as Associate Dean Academic in NIT Rourkela. A recipient of University Gold Medal in MA Anthropology examination, Dr. Mishra had his academic training at University of Hyderabad. He is also at the recipient of Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Scholarship for Doctoral Studies, Doctoral Fellowship on Tribal Studies by Ministry of Tribal Affairs, Government of India, National Scholarship, and few others. He specializes in natural resource management and sustainable livelihood, displacement issues, tribal and rural development, and agrarian studies. He has over 50 publications in professional journals of the repute. Along with some monographs, he edited one book on displacement and emerging issues in contemporary India. As a credit to his academic achievement, Dr. Mishra participated in many national and international conferences in India and abroad. Before joining at NIT in 2009, he worked with various reputed institutions like NIRT Hyderabad, CSD New Delhi, CPF Hyderabad, and with various capacities. He has earned his research and teaching experiences over the years, handling various independent and joint projects sponsored by various private and government departments, and successfully guiding 7 PhD students. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Mishra. Thank you for joining us. We will now open the forum for discussion. I would like to request Professor Manisha Sharma to share her insights on the topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Um, so, I'd like to clarify right away that I do not claim or have a tribal identity myself. My work is embedded in discourses of migrant identity and the impact of social justice arts education. Um, and to clarify, arts education, I mean the preparation of artists, art teachers, and other professionals engaging in the art world and the art market. My involvement with hybrid identity, indigeneity, and art and visual culture production through critical arts education is grounded in post-colonial globalization and decolonization literatures, and a determination to investigate what non-appropriative solidarity looks like in cultural work. So for my time today, I'd like to share a synopsis of my story in the context of this work. So, my youth was filled and impacted by various moves across central, north, and south India, making me vaguely aware of shifts in my identity as being a North Indian and South India, or things like that. Um, and aware vaguely of a sense of being from and belonging to somewhere. But my explorations of identity, cultural roots, and the impact of migration on identity really began when I moved from India to the US for my master's studies in the late 90s. There, or here, I'm in the US right now. So, like so many migrants, I suddenly found the expectation thrust on me of being an involuntary spokesperson for my people and my culture, both as an artist and as an art educator. And this was especially awkward since I was the only Indian, or indeed South Asian, in my cohort of, master's cohort, and one of the very few South Asian students in our graduate fine arts program back there in Chicago. Studying in urban India and very post-colonial English medium CBSE and ICSE schools had never prepared me for this. So it was only really in graduate school that I began learning about critical thinking and identity exploration, and my career preparing art education curriculum and pedagogical strategies for K through 12 schools, communities, and museum-based education with a social justice inquiry really began there. A significant event in this context, again, occurred in the same period when I was an education intern at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. So I was assigned to, the Field Museum has a rather large exhibit of Native American arts and culture, anthropological collection. And I was teaching an arts and craft workshop at the Northwest Pacific Native American exhibit at the museum. So I would do this every weekend for about 6 or 7 hour shifts, working with like thousands of people who would come to visit the exhibit. So inevitably, while I was teaching visitors how to make what's called parfleche purses, which are Native American bags, someone asked me, "So are you Indian?" And I very naively said, "Yes, I am." And then they asked, "What kind?" And I repeated, "What kind?" And they clarified, "Yes, what tribe?" And I replied, "Oh, I'm not that kind of Indian. I'm from India." And then they looked very confused and asked, "Then how are you here teaching about Native American crafts?" And this incident stuck with me for a long time, and it still runs through my mind. And working in that exhibition section for a year brought me to some questions that have guided my work ever since. First, as an artist and art educator, was I or how am I guilty of cultural appropriation by just doing my job and what I was told to do by my employers? Did I need to clarify my cultural identity and take permission from Native Americans to teach about their culture? Two, why were there no Native American interns or professionals in the education department at the museum when we were teaching about their culture, especially as if it belonged in the past? They used to do these things, they used to live like that. What involvement did the tribes themselves have in crafting the narratives that we were presenting in the museums? Where were they physically in the area? Were they visitors to this exhibit? Were they a target audience for the museum? Surely there had to be some Native Americans in Chicago. It's a huge city. I didn't know any of that, and nobody was talking about it. Then I asked, what did I actually know about the Native Americans and indigenous peoples as they live in the present? And what could I do to familiarize myself with their communities and speak with them with a sense of solidarity about their lived realities rather than represent them without their permission and presence? What was the complicity of the museum as institution in maintaining the project of cultural and economic colonization? Who owned and benefited from and drove the narrative of the communities represented in the museums and in various other, in the art galleries, in the art world through exhibition, curatorial, educational practice? And what participation or voice did these communities have in crafting the narrative? And how did they actually benefit from the commercial activization of their culture in the art and culture industry? So these questions led me to understand that any cultural education about cultural identity has to be dialogic and connected to the present lived realities of a community. And this is especially true in tribal communities, which tend to be super stereotyped, represented in the past tense, and mostly invisible outside of their rural originary spaces. And I think in my investigations, I have found this to be true across the globe. When I lived in Japan, after I moved, finished my master's studies, I investigated about the tribal cultures there and found that most people in Japan, my students in elementary, middle, high school, didn't know or didn't study about the indigenous peoples of Japan, which there are. Same held true for, well, little less true in Mexico. And so my education or self-education on indigenous peoples and their lived realities, their arts and cultures sort of started there. So my work deals with all kinds of hybrid and migrant identity in art and culture production. But in the case of tribal identity, there are a few practices as an art educator that I do try to incorporate, which I've learned from many indigenous peoples and their teachings across the years. And some of these might seem very basic in the current world, where we're a little bit more enlightened than we were in the late 90s. But it does take a consistent and constant ethic of care to do these things. And so I'd like to reiterate them here today. Firstly, in my teaching, and I teach it college level, work with undergraduates, graduates, and postgraduates, PhD students as well as I do workshops in museum education, and prior to my chair position and hopefully post it, work very closely with community-based organizations. So I try to know firstly who is in my classes or the group that I'm working with. How do the students or participants identify themselves in various aspects of their being? And what knowledge and questions do they bring to the group? And key to this, whether it's with tribal peoples or other hybrid identities or migrant identities or just students' identities, never assume the depth of knowledge and interest a student or an artist has in their originary culture and its art and politics. So don't make them the default go-to for information on that culture without checking with them first. And gently discourage their peers in making them the default native informant on that particular group's art and culture. Then, if I'm planning to incorporate a tribal art form in my teaching, I reach out to the cultural organizations or local experts in the areas who can speak to the culture themselves and inform and guide me on how best to do this in sort of incorporating their arts and cultural practices, their rituals and beliefs into my teaching, into the curriculum. And this, I think, is really important. I always invite them as paid and acknowledge guest speakers as experts and write them in as collaborators in grant applications so that they benefit monetarily from the work involving their culture. It happens too often that the art world sort of, and the education world sort of assumes, any cultural institutions sort of assume that this MyBap beneficiary aspect, that, oh, we're giving exposure to these people, these minorities. And firstly, that's really arrogant and assumptive. And secondly, however rich the culture, people need to eat, right? You need to earn money from your own cultural heritage, from your own skills and um, industries, craft, art and craft industries. So I think that's really important to do, whether they are students themselves, right? Pay them, make sure you're paying them. They're benefiting monetarily. Otherwise, it's cultural appropriation for me. Um, as far as possible, to organize a field trip out to the spaces where the tribal communities live, be it in the city, so that they, and especially in the city, so that they can be seen and heard as contemporary living cultures of individuals in our midst, rather than a distant, exoticized, and homogenized group. Raise question. I think another point is that it's really important to raise questions about and call out potentially colonizing practices in art and culture institutions, both in the past and in the continuing present, right, in the art world and the art market. So, for example, I mean, museums are a huge case study in this, about how where museums tend to be located, especially like university museums, where they got their collections, how they got their collections, who owns the collections, um, do the ticket entry prices to the museums that exhibit tribal cultures and arts, does any of that go to the tribals themselves or not? Are they benefiting monetarily from it? Are they involved in the label writing, descriptions, and contemporary relevance of those artifacts? Right. Another example in this context is that minority identity and representation is a very popular trend these days in the art world, right? Calls for exhibitions and sort of more focus on women artists, although women are not really a minority in the world, but that's a whole different panel. Or having a migrant identity label or a hybrid identity label or indigenous identity label, right? So that's a trend, and that's very encouraging, but we have to make sure that it doesn't stay a trend, right? It becomes normalized in practice. And a very important part of that is to consider how we make sure that it doesn't pigeonhole the artist or craftsperson into a stereotypical identity and style while making their art and craft, right? I mean, you hear this all the time. Manish Kapoor has talked about when he moved to when he started exhibiting in Britain, that he was told that his work didn't look Indian enough, right? And so, if this idea that, oh, if I'm an indigenous artist, my work must look a particular way, or it must have certain motifs in it. I don't have the right to be a contemporary or conceptual artist. I'm not being true to my roots if I am not representing those issues or their issues in particular ways. So, or that if I, as a non-Indigenous artist, am incorporating Indigenous issues um, or Black issues, then how do I have the right to do that if I'm not Black or Indigenous or from any community? So these are complicated and very delicate questions. And especially in education of artists and arts professionals, we tiptoe around them. We tend to be afraid to talk about these things because I think we don't know the answers, right? We're just asking the questions and trying to figure out the best, most ethical way in our current present to do so. So those are things that I think are really important to address in talking about hybrid identity, talk about Indigenous identity, any minoritized identity, and art and craft production. And then the last thing I want to bring up is that as I conduct research on tribal identities or migrant identities, I think it's really important not only to research and present the past, but also to contextualize what happened in the past to current voices, to current artists and craftspersons, and to represent how their voices, not to teach about a particular culture, that this culture does this and this culture does this or did this, but to make research a forum or a platform to represent and discuss how their voices are informing us as the more generalized public um, of current issues and realities of their communities, and how that works both in and out of their originary spaces. Um, so I've delved more deeply into the differences between post colonialization, which is more about the empire that left places like India, some of South America, India, Africa, but also of the nuances of how the impact of post-colonialization versus decolonialization, which is more settler colonization, settler communities, and how those nuances and those differences impact the dialogue on decolonization and how we should proceed, right? Because how we talk about decolonization and empowerment of tribal communities and arts and culture industries in India is very different from how we might talk about it in the US, right? How the repatriation of land, we talk about that in India, is very different from how we talk about it in the US. So those questions and issues of how monetary, land-based, um, sort of righting of wrongs can be done through art and culture production and studies, um, is and storytelling, I think, is very important. I think I don't know if I've gone over time. I think I'm going to stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your invaluable perspectives, Professor Sharma. It was really good to hear about your experience. Our next speaker is Dr. Nihar Ranjan Mishra. So, uh, over to you.
Uh, Good evening to everyone. And if you look into my research specifically, I don't do such directly on hybrid identity and all, but I used to work on migration and also on this urbanization, displacement, and all, which has a potential impact on identity. Because if you look into this, because when I deal with these displacement issues and migration, it is specifically creates a kind of situation for the people to retain their identity, and specifically in the place of origin and the place of destination, and also in the context of the tribals specifically, those who are suffering due to the displacement. Because when we speak about identity, what madam also already described, it is specifically the cultural aspect which reflect our identity, because it is our culture, it is our religion, it is our nationality which comes and the umbrella of under the umbrella of culture as a whole reflect our identity. And in the course of this urbanization, and also this in the course of this kind of migration, this has a tremendous impact on kind of our identity. See, I'll just give you some few examples from our my experience. If you look at this, suppose the Jharkhand, when the state Jharkhand came to exist, the entire movement, if you analyze because I used to work in social movements, if you look at the entire social movements, the tribals, specifically in the Jharkhand, their identity, the entire movement was based on their to retain the identity of Jharkhandi. But you see, and specifically which is linked to their nature, because the nature, culture, because their culture is linked to their nature and all. And in course of time, we will see that kind of after the formation of the Jharkhand, whatever the government it may be, does not matter. But everybody invited the corporates, everybody tried to extract the resources, which in course of time has brought a remarkable kind of difficulties in the context of in the form of displacement, which has really created a problem in identifying and identification for those communities, that is Jharkhand. Means they face a serious threat of retaining their cultural identity and retaining their kind of emotional attachment to the forest, which makes them distinct from others. Like that, if you look into this, there is a huge migration of the tribal communities from Bastar, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, this region. Specifically, if you look into the Dandakar and the region, there are huge kind of migration used to be held into different places, whether it is so mostly the seasonal migration. You'll see that because of this kind of seasonal migration, these people could not able to retain their own identity, which develop a sense of hybrid identity for them, because they have a different kind of identity on their own origin place. And when they migrate to the destination where mostly they work, mostly they used to go for a kind of brick industry and all. So when they go for a seasonal migration, so retaining their identity there, claiming themselves that they're originated and migrated from so and so place is really questionable. So all this kind of complexity has brought a kind of tremendous impact on these peoples. And you see that now the massive kind of urbanization, massive kind of because when we're speaking about the development today, the development has come in the form of a package, either in the form of urbanization, industrialization, modernization. All this has a kind of tremendous impact, because now when we are speaking about the development, we want to extract the resources. The moment we will go for extraction of resources, we are disturbing the tribal communities. See, you all might have heard the case of Niyamgiri from Odisha, where this Vedanta was being invited to set up its industry. But anyhow, with the intervention of the Supreme Court, it was stopped. You see, when we are speaking, you see the tribal communities in the Niyamgiri hills, whether it is Jharia tribes or kind of Dongriya tribes, Dongriya or Jharia. See, all this Dangriya is named after the Dangar, that is forest. Jariya is named after the stream, that is Jharana, the stream. See, their identity was their nature. But you see, the moment you extract those resources, the moment you destroy this Dangar, this forest, the moment you destroy this perennial river, that is, or the stream, so in what sense they will reflect their identity? I mean, so what exactly we are trying to do here in the form of globalization, in the form of urbanization, in the form of industrialization, we are trying to de-establish an identity, and we are trying to rewrite the concept of an identity here. Means we are imposing an identity for the others. Means they will be no more identified in the name of their culture, in the name of their kind of tradition. Rather, they will be named after. They will given get a new identity, which will be very difficult for them to retain, and in course of time they'll be extinct from this earth. So which is a very kind of complex phenomena here, because fine, when we're telling about hybrid identity novel, is it possible in the case of all to retain the hybrid identity? Because when we're telling about hybrid identity, it is nothing but a product of fusion of different cultures. See, and if you look into this now, suppose we are promoting ecotourism, and in the name of ecotourism, we are inviting lots of inventors to the forest area where mostly by default the tribal community are living. So there is a cultural diffusion is happening. There is a cultural fusion is happening. So how this community, because we all know that, because for everybody now the survival and livelihood is the uh, utmost requirement. See, when we are promoting the ecotourism, see, in the name of ecotourism, what is happening? The people are eagerly accepting the introduction of others. And what exactly happening? The moment the outsiders are entering, and immediately in the name of ecotourism, we are developing urbanization there. So then there is a cultural diffusion is happening. There is a language is being diffused, and the people, the tribals who have lost their kind of language, because now if you ask the most of the young tribal youths, they don't have can speak their own language. They are going for a kind of because of this assimilation and diffusion, they are going for a mainstream language, whether in a kind of Hindi, or if it belongs to Odisha, Odia, Bengali, Jharkhandi, or this Telugu, Tamil, whatever, maybe the language they're adopting instead of their own tribal languages, which is creating a kind of problem for them to retain their identity. Even though we can claim they have a hybrid identity, both they have an identity of their own tribe, or either they have an identity of a mainstream language, but they will lose the importance on both, and at the end they will be extinct, and their language will be extinct, their culture will be extinct, and they will be a kind of retain themselves as a laborer, and with a new identity will develop for them, that is a kind of labor identity, which will really will be a threat. And you see, in course of this, if you look into this urbanization, industrialization, this migration, this has commodified everything. Because now, for us, because in global context, when we're looking to the globalization, we have commodified everything now. We have commodified the nature, we have commodified the human beings, we have even commodified our relationship. Because you see, now nobody has time, nobody has time, nobody wants to speak freely, nobody wants to mingle freely, because everything is identified in the name of commodity, because we have commodified everything. And the moment we commodified everything, what kind of new identity will we bring? So that is also very a kind of a question. And if you look at the cultural context also, whether it is material culture, non-material culture, because sometimes what is happening, the government is giving more emphasis on protection of the culture, either in the promoting the what Madam also told, establishing the museum, establishing the tribal art, tribal artisans market and all. So can it resolve the problems? And specifically, you'll see the tribal artists, because I used to work on NTFE, non-timber forest product, where specifically I looked into the pan-Indian context. I used to look into that how to promote this tribals who are mostly deals with the artisans and artifacts. You see, if you look at most of the government policies, I'm not criticizing any government, rather I'm criticizing, looking to the very things from a very critical perspective. What we claim is sociological imagination perspective. See, when the government is giving kind of bamboos to bamboo industry on a kind of subsidized rate, but the government is not giving any subsidized rate to the artisans who are mostly depending on the bamboo. So what exactly will happen? So the community which is known as a kind of bamboo artisans, so they are losing their identity because they're losing the bamboo. They're losing the forest, because the government, in the name of development, in the name of mining, the entire forest is being encroached, the entire forest is being collapsed. So where the resource will come? The depletion of the resources is another threat for retaining the tribal art. And also, the another is, if you look at the patent, now we are all speaking about the patent. And is it possible in the context of the poor indigenous tribal communities? to deal with any kind of formal policy and all and retain their patent. And what is happening because of this globalization? All other market intervention is happening. They are taking over all these things. And you see how much kind of help this Madhuban art, Varli art, this Gond art, the Bhil art, the Saura art, which is Odisha is quite famous for the Saura art and all. What much benefit they have got? Does this tribal got an identity? No. And you see, I'll tell one example. You see, there is a Langia Sora tribe which specifically live in Andhra Pradesh and Odisha border, and they used to their dressing pattern is very unique. They will have a like a tail in the backside. Kind of, if you look at their dress pattern, for which they used to speak as a Lanja, that is tail. So for which they are named as a Langia Sora. See, because of this intervention of this Christianity, and in those regions, so what exactly happened? They've adopted the Christianity, and we all know that wherever the Christianity has entered, the modernity has entered in a more faster way than the other areas, because the Westernization, all this Western philosophy, Western culture has come very fast. And now, not a single Lanjasura community is wearing their traditional dress. They're all wearing their shorts, pants, the half shorts, half pants, and all. They're highly modernized in their dressing pattern. And we all know that, and they are adopting the fashion technology. Not because you see our identity also reflect in the form of our fashion, because you see when we go to any tribal area, immediately we remark or identify one tribe the moment we see their dress pattern. Because you see, when we see a Banjara tribe, by seeing their dress we identify this Banjara tribe. By seeing a Bhil tribe, by seeing their fashions, their dress pattern and all, we identify them. They belongs to these tribes. Because as an anthropologist, we used to look at the dressing pattern and immediately we identify from their facial technology, their fashion technology and all. But you see, in course of this development and in the form of this globalization and all, so all these things has created a problem for their identity, and they have lost their identity, and for which the entire machinery, entire the system is responsible. So how to retain, because sometimes government is telling we want this we are doing for documentation, we are popularizing their art, we are recognizing their art, we are encouraging the tribal youths. See how many tribal youths are being encouraged, because now we are all speaking about this kind of this startup and all. How we are promoting the startup among the tribals? Or in the name of the tribal art, or in the name of tribal medicine, the non-tribals is entering into tribal area and starting a startup, and the government is sponsoring for that. See what I'm telling, let us identify, let us document, let us send the people. Because even when I was advisor body of NIF, National Innovation Foundation, I used to tell them, send those intensive students to the different remote tribal areas and tell them to document their innovation. Tell the governments or you people sponsor them, give them some kind of a new identity to them. So that will help in bringing a new identity for them, and that will also help also retaining their own identity, because it is not we who will define an identity for them. Rather, we should all try how the tribal identity can be retained, how their culture, because once the culture is being disturbed, they lose their identity. And in the form of kind of disturbing their identity, if you tell that hybrid identity and all these things, that will not sustain forever. And today they are imitating another identity, next day they will imitate another identity. So in course of time, they are the people whose culture will be extended, their identity will be extended. So in that sense, so we have to very seriously work how the, because obviously the migration and the urbanization will have a serious impact on this identity, which is going for a kind of hybrid identity. And unless and until we very critically examine, then we cannot retain their identity. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mishra, for your vital observations. It was really glad to hear. I believe Dr. Pathak won't be able to join us this evening. So, moving forward to our question and answer session. My first question is to Professor Manisha Sharma. Do you think that integrating modern elements into traditional art forms affect the authenticity of the work? Why or why not?
Thank you for the question. I was listening to Dr. Mishra on your last point. Thank you for the points that you made, Dr. Mishra. This is something that I struggle with a little bit, as not as a maker, but as an educator. Um, so I'll respond in with two examples that show the conflict in this, a conflict I have about this question. One is in the kind of work that is being done in there's an organization that I had the privilege of working with and studying a little bit, that works with fair trade, and specifically for in the interests of tribal women across the world, right? So this organization um, is US based, and the educators and art and cultural workers, they have a team of designers, you know, fashion students, marketing students, who go to different parts of the world, especially in the third world. So they work in India, they work in South Africa, they work in Kenya, they work in Ghana, um, they work with the Maori in New Zealand, lots of places in Latin America. And they work with these really poor tribal communities, um, and have them produce their indigenous arts and craft, but with the designers' input on what will sell in the Western market, right? So for an example, there was like a child's toy, which is generally um, left in its form in natural wood, but they and like this weaving of these scarves that is done in particular colors and dyeing techniques. And the input that the design students said was, after the first year and they didn't sell that well, was that, well, if you're selling in the West, best sales are around Christmas time, and red and green sell really well. So the indigenous women that they were working with, started changing some of their traditional motifs to make these saleable red and green colored objects, and modified some of the motifs that were on these products, for better sales. Now, aesthetically, I rebelled against this, right? It's like, well, you're destroying or you're taking away the authenticity of the original art form. But then in a video call with some of these women, the tribal women, they said, well, if we're using this is our art form and our craft form, and if what we do ritualistically and how we use it within our own community has nothing to do with how we're using to monetize this to improve our own lives. So these are the ritualistic and the traditional aspect, for us, doesn't change what it means to us, if we have to if but if we can use it to send our children to school and make the women more independent, and improve our everyday life in the villages that we live in. So that was a really thoughtful, a thought-provoking idea, that what we assume in urban spaces and in these institutional art market, art world spheres, about how the sanctity and sacredness of the original arts and motifs and cultural rituals is is problematic, right? So again, I think this is why having their voices represent what they feel is really important. A second example of where I see change being natural and good is in how the digitization of art forms and in activism especially. So a few years back, there was in 2019, especially when the CAA and NCR bills were being brought up in India, and there was a lot of arts and especially music activism, music-based activism, that was coming up on YouTube, and I written about this in one of my articles. But there was a video called Warli Revolt that came out, which was a call to protect the rights of the Warli tribe in Maharashtra. And this spoken word rapified song performance is by it's in Marathi by the artist Swadesi, who's a rap artist, and it features very prominently the Are tribal chieftain Prakash Boyer as part of the Swadeshi movement collective. And in that video, they rap about land grabbing by the government and corporate interests and the erasure of tribal ways of life. And I think it's a really powerful piece, and very interestingly for me as a visual artist, the video of the song animates the very famous folk art, Worli painting, and depicts the life and benefits of the Worli tribe. So it sort of, and it talks about both traditional life and way of life of the Worli tribe, as well as the current issues of deforestation and forced migration that they're facing. So for me, that is a really interesting and empowering way of modernizing or integrating modern elements, modern technologies and platforms into traditional art forms, to speak to the issues and lived realities of tribal peoples. And for me, that's really authentic, because that's what most tribal work does, is talk about the lived experiences, the lives, the rituals, the beliefs of that particular tribe. It embodies their being. So if the technology of new technology is incorporated, or new materials are incorporated, I don't think it affects the authenticity, because it's the people that make the tribe, right? They make the art and craft. The craft doesn't make them. So this idea of living cultures, I think arts and craft demonstrating and representing living cultures is really important. And we shouldn't again pigeonhole that, oh, if you belong to this, then your art and craft must look like this, you must believe this. It's the people that we should be listening to, and their representations through art and craft. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for the answer, ma'am. My next question is to Dr. Mishra. So, what role do colonial history and post colonial realities play in shaping hybrid identities among tribal artists?
Uh, you see, if you'll unfold the history, you'll see that at the time of colonial period, the most of the time the Europeans, the Western peoples, faced lots of difficulties with the tribals, and they tried to give them a very separate identity without understanding them, because they really faced the difficulties from them. So, for which they adopted the policy of isolation, and that was the main kind of thrust aspect for them to develop a sense of a kind of identity for the tribals. And they always wants to make them away from the mainstreams, so that they can be out, and they cannot revolt against them. So that was exactly a kind of colonial administrative aspect of keeping the tribals uh, in an isolated way, and for which giving a kind of new identity to them without disturbing them. So, but if you look into the post-colonial realities specifically, the what exactly happened. The Western people left. The initially at the time of the Nehru's Panchashil policy was really remarkable policy for retaining the tribal identity, because through Panchashil he was trying to not to disturb tribes. Even you all know that there are different policies being adopted by the various Elohim and all others, Gure and all. That is assimilation, integration, isolation, assimilation, and integration. And then if you look at this kind of all this policy was really tried to give a new identity to the tribals. Means sometimes what we want in the form of isolation, we want to retain their identity without creating a hybrid identity for them. Then, in the form of assimilation, we tried a hybrid identity for them because there will be a cultural diffusion. And then, in the form of integration, the same aspect we also followed. But if you look into all these things, even in the Panchashila also, what the Nehru told that we should not over administer, we should not disturb them, we should not disturb their culture, let them to rule on their own. All these different policy aspects were in the Panchashila things. So, but if you look at this kind of post-colonial realities, even the colonial left, but the legacy of colonial philosophy, the colonial culture is being imposed on this tribal in the name of development, which I already discussed. That how in the name of development we have imposed this Western philosophy and Western culture on this, and we have tried to develop another identity for them. So this is exactly if you look at the colonial, and because colonials and sometimes the colonial people didn't understand them and they defined them as a criminal tribe and all. They were given a different kind of identity for them to them. So, but in course of time, we have gone from this colonial philosophy, and most of the times also we still follow the colonial policy in the context of tribal development. Because see, if you look at the kind of in Forest Act 1927, then 2006 only Forest Act came. We took almost 100 years to bring an act for the giving an identity, because we all know that the moment this forest department came in a kind of in 18 sorry 65 and all, so that gives a kind of threat to the tribal identity during British. But in the 2006 only we thought that we should give the back the forest to the tribes, which is a major source of identity for them. So that's why the colonial reality, post-colonial reality is something different, which is really creating a disturbance in the name of development for the tribal identity, and which is really questionable. Thank you.
Thank you for the answer, sir. Moving forward to the second set of questions. Coming back to Professor Sharma. Ma'am, how have the traditional influences of tribal heritage influenced your work?
Um, so again, this is through the benefit of education. I don't claim any tribal heritage myself, but through this idea of investigating, as I shared that story or incident about being asked what kind of Indian I am. This question of what does it mean to be Indian? What does it look like? What does it mean? Is a constant refrain in my head throughout my career and my work and my life, both as an educator and as an artist. Um, I would say the most so both from South Asian as well as North American context of what I've studied, what I've understood, the most about the traditions of Native peoples. I think as a student of art and design, I have a design background. The excellence of visual storytelling is something that has influenced both my writing and my artwork. So this idea of encapsulating and the beauty and depth to which indigenous cultures sort of create symbols, do symbols and icon design, and using symbols and icons to build really rich narratives through very enduring motifs. Like, that's something that always blows my mind. um, and whatever we do in advertising and contemporary design, like, we have so much to learn about the longevity of creating icons and symbols, um, and graphic storytelling. um, so visually speaking, that I think is the greatest influence. The other is adaptation. The adaptation of especially nomadic tribes. So way back, there's an old movie, old as in like it's from the 80s or 90s, called Lachodrome, and it's a documentary that traces the movement of gypsies across the world. And the movie starts with, the documentary starts with India, the Gujars, right, and how they migrated across time, um, through Pakistan, Afghanistan, into Iran, and then into Poland, Europe, and on the other route, and then within Africa, and then from there to the New World, um, to the Americas, and it traces it through the development of music, right, and the way that gypsies have incorporated music of the local area that they are in, and built new and constructed, told stories of their lives and of the locality of the region that they were inhabiting, or they inhabit. And then the growth and development of very specific art forms, whether it's in dance or in musical instruments, in song, um, through and right up to the influences in jazz and blues, which is amazing. And so this idea that, again, it takes me back to the first question, right, that if you think of gypsies in particular as indigenous peoples that are nomadic peoples, right, this idea of how they retained an idea of home even when you are constantly migrating, and in modern context don't have the papers to go back to your land of origin, right, it's very unlikely that the Roma people in Europe will, they identify with as Indians, or with India, they call India their homeland in many cases. But if they move to India, they come to visit India, they'll never be allowed back to Europe, right, because they don't have the papers. So how does one look at the idea and retain the idea of home and home identity while adapting and moving and growing um, in language, in arts and culture? I think that's a fascinating and really instructive area to look at, to learn from tribal cultures and their heritage.
Thank you for sharing your experiences, ma'am. To Dr. Mishra, my next question is: how do you think the concept of hybrid identities will evolve as globalization continues to influence tribal communities?
Okay. So, ma'am, which I already discussed while speaking, that you see, while we are speaking about this kind of globalization, the specifically we are moving towards a monoculture kind of things. See, which is really giving a kind of developing a sense of hybrid identity. See, if you look at this, their indigenous culture, indigenous knowledge, their folk arts, and our everything has been under threat because of this globalization, because the massive market-driven approach, because of this globalization, has really commodified their culture, their dance, their folk art, everything. So it's another aspect also. If you see that the tribal artists were not adequately remunerated, so for which they are also being forced to leave their kind of traditional occupations. And the second thing is also the because of this globalization, the commercialization has come as a very important aspect to the globalization, which has replaced the many kind of tribal arts, handicrafts, and all. See, one thing you'll see that the digitalization of all these art forms, because you now see if you go to these tribal areas, suppose if there are some tribal communities or the rural communities who used to print this, who used to weave the sarees and all. Now what is happening because of this machinery, because of this development in industry and digital art, all their different art is being printed, so which is sold in the market in the low cost price, and the production is very high, for which the tribals face real difficulties in selling their product, for which they were quite famous because the particular art was given identity to a particular community. But in course of time, what happened? This digital form of this kind of art and all has really becomes a threat for them, and also they cannot develop such kind of product which is the community really needs, the what exactly the market needs. It is very difficult in the part of this artist, tribal artists, to produce it because they need huge resources, they need huge trainings. Because you see, even suppose I'll just give a small example. Suppose whenever earlier we used to go for any party and all, we used to take the meals in a sal plate or siali plates. But you see today, even though we know that these thermocol plates and all other plates are very banned, but we still love to have food in a very highly designed plates. Either it is made through thermocol, made through any polythene, whatever, doesn't matter. But is it possible in the context of the tribal communities to who used to prepare their plates using the sal leaves and this all these plates, is it possible in their part to produce this kind of plate and sell in the market? So what exactly happening? They are lagging the training, they're lagging the interest, and also they don't have financial resources also, which is really creating a problem for them to kind of, because it is called as an increasing the expensiveness of the product in the markets for them. But while in the from market we are getting in a very low cost the same kind of product with a more designed way. So that's why the interest of us is changing. It is also a kind of creating a problems. And at the same time, we want to develop the everything. The culture is being commercialized. So when the culture is being commercialized, accommodating these tribal communities really become a problem. Because when we are trying to commercialize this culture, see the everybody can intervene. Because you see, suppose I'll tell you an example, the Sambalpuri dance. They suppose this Chou dance in Moirvanj and all this region, which is very close to West Bengal and all. There are certain kind of tribal communities. Suppose Goan dance, the Goan tribes, the Bhil tribes, they have a particular kind of dance and all. But what exactly happening in the process of this commercialization of this dance? Most of the non-tribal people are getting into this. They are dancing. They are forming a kind of dance group, and they are developing in the market. Whenever there is any kind of function in the name of tribal, these people are dressed up there like them, and they are performing the arts. So here, what is happening? We are retaining a culture, but the real community who supposed to get the benefit and having an interest of protecting their identity, they lost it. So which is really a kind of problem. So this globalization has really become a threat for this identity, which is bringing in hybrid identity for these peoples. And that is really a kind of difficult, because there is a huge shift is happening from the traditional to modern.
Thank you so much, sir. This has been a rather insightful session, to say the least. With that, we come to an end to tonight's discussion. I thank each of you for sharing your knowledge and valuable insights with us. I'm sure our audience had a wonderful time and have learned a lot as well. We are grateful to you for taking out time from your busy schedules and for being a part of this discussion. It was an absolute pleasure to have been in your company this evening. This is to remind that we are calling for submissions on cross-culturalization of tribal communities, the details of which can be viewed on www.tellmeyourstory.biz. With that, I conclude the session. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Val. Thank you.
Thank
Namaste.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Val.